Join me as I dive deep into the complex world of school violence responses to uncover what's really going on from my perspective. Learn more ahead by keeping watching. It's just been a really hard week. I'm being really candid in this video. Usually I use things like statistics and I use a lot of references and scholarly information. And this video is a little bit different. And the reason why is because I feel like I need to respond to some of the things that have been going on with school violence lately. It's been a really, really heavy week. Last week was just very heavy to me, depressing. As far as what's going on in education, what really bothered me last week were two stories that had to do with school violence. And this is really personal to me because I have worked in so many different schools and experienced so many different lockdowns. The school that I worked at most recently has had three events of weapons being found on campus, 3 lockdowns this school year, and it's November. And school violence to me is such a astounding problem in this country, where we have so many resources. In many ways, the United States is the richest country in the world still, and yet we constantly have this problem that no other country has. There are fights all over the world, and there are things like stabbings that happens in China and other parts of Asia quite a bit where students will stab, but those generally do not take on the gravity of gun violence. It's very hard to kill someone in a mass scale with stabbings. There was actually a stabbing at a high school I used to work at. Very unfortunate of it, but only one person was injured, and it was not a serious injury. He was out of the hospital in a few days. A teacher was able to take that student down very easily. Whereas when it comes to gun violence, things can get really serious and really deadly very quickly. And again, we're the only country that has a major problem with gun violence in the whole world. So people say, well, it's not the guns. Well, it kind of is. And it's kind of our culture of not caring for children enough to do something about this. This has been a problem for well over 25 years, and yet nothing has been done to really stop this problem. It's just thoughts and prayers. And so there were 2 events last week that really kind of brought this home for me. 2 stories that were in the news. And they really pointed out some of the things that I think are missing in this narrative about violence in schools. And so the first story was one that many of you have probably already heard about. In 2023 in Newport News, Virginia, a 6 years old, shot his teacher, and the teacher actually has a permanent bullet in her body. They couldn't remove the bullet safely, so she actually has a bullet in her body and will for the rest of her life. It's caused major health effects, not to mention all the trauma for the other students involved. And that teacher just received a $10 million settlement in a lawsuit against the assistant principal who really ignored this. It was reported that the student could have a weapon, and she just stayed in her office and did not come and search the student. One thing that's missing when talking about these situations is that, generally speaking, especially in larger school districts where there are a lot of policies, only administration can handle these type of things. They're the only ones that can search students. And it's also really hard for teachers to teach a class of 25, 30 students when this is going on. So administration did not take this seriously, and then she was shot. And that has really led to a lot of uproar in the media, and rightly so, because that was totally preventable. It shouldn't have happened. And it shows how we don't trust teachers. We don't believe teachers, and how teachers' lives are really considered expendable. And the child rights are always considered above the teachers, even though that child could have shot a classmate, and that would have been incredibly tragic also. But it was just not seen enough as a priority. Safety was not seen enough as a priority in this case, and with very, very tragic consequences. And there were actually people who testified saying that that this was part of the job, that this is a workers' compensation issue. Violence is an occupational hazard. It shouldn't be that way in our schools. And of course, that teacher's no longer teaching, and I don't blame her. I wouldn't teach either. And it just is very disheartening to hear some of this, what this poor teacher went through, and the fact that it was considered part of her job. And then also last week, or late last week, I think it was Friday, at a high school in North Charleston, Fort Dorchester, that I have ties to because I know people who go to that school, and I also had one of my assistant principals was at that school, and it's considered a very good school in the area. And there was an incident there where school resource officer, we call those SROs, basically school cops, because in this country you have school cops because schools are considered dangerous places, which again is, that shouldn't have to happen. But anyway, they were in the cafeteria, and it was reported that a student might have a gun in his pocket. The student happened to be autistic. He had special needs. He couldn't communicate very well. And the student said, "Oh, I have a switch in my pocket." And the SRO thought that meant a Glock switch. He thought it meant a type of gun. And so he pulled out his gun, and he cuffed the student. He got him on the ground. And he searched the student, and it was not a Glock. It was a Nintendo Switch, which was like the student's safety object. It was something that helped brought him comfort. And that has turned into a huge media circus. People are really upset that happened to that child. Of course, he was traumatized. That's a traumatic thing to happen. And the family is actually considering a lawsuit against the school, and particularly this because this child was autistic, there's this idea that was the wrong thing to do. So what I see, there are a few things that I see in both of these cases that have kind of been left out of the narrative, in my opinion. That unless you have worked in a school, you would not understand, and you know firsthand what goes on, you may not understand what really was happening in these cases. There's some insights that I had that I don't think most people would have thought about. I've worked in over 20 schools now. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about that. So the first thing that I noticed in both of these cases was that there was a breakdown in students. It's closer to 20%, and actually 20%. I worked in a school once where 30% of the students who receive special education services. So those are students who have been diagnosed with a disability. And here in the United States, for reasons that are still being discussed, we're having a large increase of students with behavior problems, and students who have disabilities that may make them be either non-communicative or make them be violent. And it's not really well understood, I think, by most of the public, the rights that students have when they have a disability in the United States. When a student has a disability, that child also has the right to what's called a free and appropriate public education. And what that means in practice is that it's harder to suspend or expel that child. And there's the idea that every child should be included. And that's to the point where it's sometimes a little bit ridiculous in some cases. For example, I know of cases where children who were entirely nonverbal, they couldn't talk, they couldn't really interact very much. And I know in one case of a child who had to stay in a bed because she was just very severely disabled and she couldn't do anything. She had the mind of an infant. She was actually wheeled into a regular classroom and just lay there. It's hard to know how that's going to benefit that student. But there's this idea that children need to be included with other children. The idea of inclusion has kind of taken the place of common sense and of what's right for children. So in the case of the teacher who was the 6-year-old, shot by a 6-year-old. That child had major behavior problems, and it's been reported that parents refuse special education services. So everyone would have been safer if that child had been in a special classroom with people who are trained to help that child. However, the parents refused to do that. The child had ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That's not something that usually causes violence. Usually those children just can't focus very well, and they may be all over the place. But when I saw an interview with the mother. That's what she blamed it on. They're blaming the disability, and the child is absolved from consequences. This child had been very, very violent in the past. He had actually choked a teacher the year before, and he had been so violent that until the week that this incident happened, there had been required for a parent to accompany him to school, which is something that I've never encountered. That's a very extreme thing. He was so violent that a parent had to go to school with him every day. The week that this occurred, that it was seen that he was doing better, and so that was taken away. The student had actually been suspended the week before because he broke the teacher's tail. Schools are not mental hospitals. They shouldn't be. And they shouldn't be places where people are scared, where children can be violent. But there was a breakdown in the support here. He didn't have anyone with him. And the support that the assistant principal should have provided in handling the situation was not there. They said that she was very busy with dealing with state tests. And then in the case of the Fort Dorchester student, the 16-year-old autistic student, he was supposed to have a 101A. We also call that a shadow. And that's a very restrictive thing. Schools don't often do that because it costs a lot of money, and it's very restrictive. That you basically have a person follow you all day long in a school. You have an aide that works with you all day and stays with you. And again, that's a pretty severe accommodation, a pretty severe thing to do. And usually when those students have that, it means that they face significant issues. It's not something that happens a lot. In fact, in one of the school districts I worked, they just didn't do it. So if this child had an aide, he's pretty severely disabled. And that aide wasn't there. And in the things I read, I never found out why that aide wasn't there. It's quite possible that the aide was sick that day, or maybe the aide was using the restroom. I don't know. I don't know why the aide wasn't there. That was a breakdown in that student support system. If the aide had been there, this never would have happened. And the school's going to be blamed for that, but there are lots of reasons why an aide can't be with someone all the time. It's very unrealistic to have someone be with one student all the time. Things are going to happen. People get sick. People have to get water. They have to eat lunch. They have to go to the restroom. But the school should have had some sort of plan for when that happened. And it looked like something happened and that plan wasn't followed. So there's a breakdown support on that. The second thing is that both of these cases were based on a perception of threat. And that the threat was not there. And when you hear the testimony of the people involved with this case and you read about the story, it's fairly clear that this teacher wasn't taken seriously. She was thought of as just someone who was overreacting. And there was actually other people involved. A reading specialist was involved with this. And those people were not taken seriously either. So the perception of threat was very low for this school. And it was not taken seriously when it should have been. And then in the Fort Dorchester High School case, the opposite happened. So the perception of threat was taken so seriously that now there's a controversy over it. And there's this idea that they should have slowed down. Some of the comments I saw said that the cops should have known that, the SRO should have known that the student was autistic. Fort Dorchester High School has over 2,500 students. And there is just no way that any personnel member is going to know every single student in that school. And to slow down and to maybe look at the student's plan, which was, again, something that people were mentioning that could have been dangerous. So here the perception of the threat was taken seriously. And so you can't win. Either schools are doing too little, as in the case of this teacher in Newport News, Virginia. Schools were not taking her seriously, and that led to a major amount of violence and tragedy. Or you get blamed because you take it too seriously. And so we need standards about threats and when threats are when. People need training to know about school violence and when to intervene and when to not. So another thing is that I recognize in this, and this is probably the most disturbing thing to me of both of the situations, is that there was a blame game involved. In the case of the Newport News, Virginia case, The school tried to blame the teacher and tried to put the blame on her. There was an interview with the parent on the Today Show where the parent of the child said, well, the teacher ignored my child. And he was mad at her because there was this incident with the phone where by accident he broke the phone. Again, the parent won't take responsibility and say, well, the child broke the phone. They won't take responsibility for that. They say it's an accident. And, my child didn't like this teacher because this teacher did my child wrong, and that's why. And she even says this is a normal thing for a 6-year-old to have a tantrum when they don't feel liked, when they don't feel supported. 6-year-olds may have tantrums, but they usually don't lead to gun violence, and they usually don't lead to teachers being permanently injured. But the blame was put on the teacher. And even in the trial, they were trying to deflect blame from the assistant principal, who didn't take this seriously, and they were trying to put the blame on the teacher. And then in the Fort Dorchester situation, in the high school with the autistic child, there was a lot of blame put on the SRO because he traumatized his child. And I don't doubt that the child was traumatized by this. It's a traumatic thing to have a gun pulled on you and to be considered a threat. I don't doubt that for a minute. But the aide was not there that should have been helping in this situation. And again, this is a huge school, over 2,500 students. Yet, right away, law enforcement was blamed for trying to do something that could have, if the child had had a gun, been tremendously horrible. The blame was immediately put on the school and on the SRO. And that kind of brings me to kind of my final point, which is that the humanity of the people involved in these cases is being ignored. It is not practical and not appropriate to expect a young teacher to be able to deal with major behavior problems in a school. It's not. It's not appropriate to expect a teacher to be a miracle worker and deal with this very violent child while dealing with all these other students. We're ignoring the humanity involved here and saying that it was just part of the job and that this was a workers' compensation issue because it was an occupational hazard. That is totally ignoring humanity and totally ignoring the humanness of this young teacher who was just trying to do the best she could. And I think the jury saw that. And that's why the jury did put such big damages, $10 million. That teacher will be set up for life. And I think she should be. Because you're ignoring humanity, you're ignoring human rights, and you're ignoring what's possible for one person to do. This teacher was expected to do it all. She was expected to handle this very violent child and to like him and to give him attention. It's not practical. That's not respectful of the humanness of people, that people are people and they do make mistakes. And they can't always do everything. They can't be perfect. I find that this theme is even more prevalent in the case of the SRO. In a school with over 2,500 students, huge school, he was expected to right away know which student was autistic. Some of the comments I saw were things like, well, did he not know? Did he not know that this student was autistic? Well, hello. He didn't know. He wouldn't have done what he did if he knew that. To expect someone to know that in the case of a huge school and expect someone to make a split-second decision without knowing all the facts, that's not practical, and that's ignoring human nature. That's ignoring the fact that people have to do things that are not perfect in life. And that teachers are not taking it seriously, and that child had a gun, that SRO would have been blamed, and his whole life would have been devastated. He wouldn't have a job. He could have even been injured himself. And he would never forgiven himself. He had to do knowing the information he had at the time, he did what he thought was best. It's ignoring that teachers and still school staff are people. If you work at a school, you are supposed to be a hero. You are supposed to differentiate for students, but yet use the same curriculum. You are supposed to be able to navigate all kinds of mandates and all kinds of parent issues. You're just supposed to be perfect. People are not perfect. And it's time that we stop expecting that of school personnel and teachers. That's not fair. It's not just. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have such a big school violence problem here. We also have a problem because of guns. I'll say it. We have a problem with guns because children have access to guns. That child should not have had access to a gun in Newport News, Virginia. And in kind of a good nod to the law enforcement there, the mother got in trouble for that. The mother, I believe, got 2 years of prison. A civilized society should not have children scared to go to school, period. And it should not have teachers who are scared to work, period. And it should not have acts of violence at school, period. And it's time that we wake up and we value children and